Okay, so I think one of the key things for us to look at also is how we can eat a healthy, balanced diet and take into account all the things we've been discussing previously, but still to be able to do this relatively on a budget and in a way that we're not wasting food and that we don't feel like we're spending all of our time and money on what we're eating. And I think there's a lot of really good practical tips and suggestions we could make about how we can do this. I think one of the things that I find useful is, which we mentioned before as well, is about cooking things from scratch. So not always thinking, actually, it's really easy to buy a jar of sauce to make your pasta with. It takes minutes to make that yourself, a can of chopped tomatoes and a few herbs and spices, and you've got complete control over what's in there, especially if you're feeding it to your children. There's not additional sugar, there's no too much salt in there, and you've no preservatives because you're making that fresh. I think that is one example of something that you could make yourself quite easily and get into the habit of doing. You could freeze, you could batch make loads of sauce if you were doing a lot of that and freeze that. And talking about frozen, another thing I think people sometimes are surprised that, frozen vegetables are often quite just as good as fresh. I mean, taste wise, sometimes they might not feel that way, but cheap and easy, and that it's just a good practical way of being able to include more vegetables, and it's okay to use frozen vegetables. Often, the nutrient content is pretty good. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's because they're frozen as they're picked, aren't they? And so the nutrient content in there is really rich. So they're fantastic things, like having a bag of frozen peas to be able to add into any dish. One, it gives you a bit more protein in there, some colour, but it bulks it out as well. Other things I tend to use quite a lot of are lentils.
Yeah.
So I tend to use the brown lentils or greens, so that don't need to be pre-cooked. And I will shove those in things like a bolognese or a chili and make that, whether it's meat or vegetarian, make it go further. I think that's the key. It's always easier to make another 1 or 2 portions rather than start from scratch. So like you say, to cook it and freeze a portion, or if you're cooking something like mince, have some extra that you can turn into a chili or something the next day.
Yeah, and like you say, lentils and red lentils also, they're such a great thing to add into anything you're making, any stew, soup with vegetables. Bulks it out and gives you that bit of protein as well, and cheap, really cheap, and they last. So yeah, quite a good addition to your weekly menu. And talking about menus, I think that's something that also can be quite useful, is to plan. So planning, having a sort of menu plan, which you can then shop accordingly, really makes a difference in terms of waste and just buying what you need and just cooking with that, rather than having a load of unnecessary things in your cupboard and not actually using them and ending up throwing them out. Menu planning and being prepared, goes a long way, I think, for
definitely
a lot of reasons. Yeah.
I like things. So if I was going to cook a roast chicken on a Sunday, then the next day we might have a curry or a stir fry. So strip the carcass and add that into a stir fry curry, something like that. So you've got almost 2 meals as one. Or, when my kids were little, I might do enough roast potatoes and things so that we would have another roast meal the next day.
Yeah.
Because it was a meal that my kids ate really well. So that was something that we do. I'd use
leftovers for lunch boxes. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, there's no need to waste anything really like that.
And making things into a frittata, you can use leftover veg, can't you? If you've done excess for the night, that evening meal, and you can have so many different flavor combinations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find also if something starts to go a bit, broccoli, for example, I had a broccoli in the fridge that was starting to be, look a little bit dodgy and turn a little bit, but I put that I made a frittata with that. It took me minutes to put it all together, and I could use that broccoli, whereas I wouldn't have maybe eaten it on its own, but you can put it into something and it was delicious. It didn't matter that it was a little bit past it.
And things like a bit of, if you've got cheddar or some cheese that's maybe seen its best, putting that in a frittata again is brilliant, isn't it? Because it just adds flavour.
Yeah, and you said about chicken. I think that's another thing I found is buying a whole chicken and chopping it up into different pieces. Can seem a bit daunting at first, but once you sort of just have a go, you realize actually there's not that much to it, and it saves loads of money rather than buying a pack of breasts or some thighs and some chicken wings. Buying a whole good quality chicken, cutting that up, works out a lot cheaper, and it just makes more sense than buying it in the bits already cut. Yeah.
And being a bit savvy, if you've got a supermarket near you and you know when they're going to reduce items.
Absolutely.
Going back then, whether it's vegetables, whether it's meat, even if you're not going to eat it that day, even stuff like punnets of mushrooms, I would just cook them all down and freeze them like that. I wouldn't freeze them as they were, but I'd cook it down and then freeze it to add to things. But that's a really good way of getting food for very little money. And things like the berries and things that may be a little bit more expensive normally, that can be a good way of buying those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we mentioned it before in another session, but about eating seasonally. I think that is a real major one for, saving money, and obviously, again, looking at getting the best nutrients at the time. I think that is really important.
Yeah, when foods are in an abundance, it brings the price down, doesn't it? So eating seasonally can be really good. So in the summer, most people grow courgettes and tomatoes maybe, and you might get a whole load of those, a glut of those. But starting to look at things like the farmers market, they're really good value for money, and the food is so fresh. And if you're concerned about things like some of the pesticides as well, a lot of farmers, smaller scale farmers, they won't use the same level of pesticides that some of the big supermarket farmers would do.
Yeah,
and the wonky veg and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of that around, and even people giving, people that have allotments locally, it's worth having a little look out where you live. If there are any near you, people often give stuff away that they've got too much of, or give it away on, on different online platforms and things like that, where so I've got 10 courgettes, leaving them outside my front door, come and get them. There's, I see a lot of that going on. So that's another way of there's food around, and
and soups are a great way of, a friend of mine used to call a fridge soup, and it was never the same twice, because it literally was what was in the fridge at the end of the week would go into soup. And that's where you've got things like your cauliflower stalks, your broccoli stalks can all go in there. Things like that we maybe wouldn't normally eat, but are really edible and perfectly good for you.
Absolutely. And can be frozen as well, and you could have that ready as a quick lunch or a quick dinner. Yeah.